All right, folks, closing out the show today with our first of what will end up being 10 or 12 or so different NBA draft profiles, picking a prospect out of the college ranks who is in the NBA draft process. We're going to speak to Leaf, who is also the host of the NBA Locked On NBA Big Board podcast. We're going to talk about each player's strengths, their weaknesses, where we kind of have them on the mock drafts, on the big boards, and maybe some potential team fits for each player as well. We're starting off, since we were talking about Virginia, we figured we'd roll through, keep talking about the Cavs, and end up talking about Ryan Dunn, one of the more, I think, polarizing prospects in a draft class that is just kind of inherently polarizing. There's not really any consensus at the top. It's not a particularly good class in terms of top end talent, although it's got a decent amount of depth. There's a lot of polarizing players, and Ryan Dunn stands out to me because he's the 6'8", 210-pound wing. He spent 2 years at Virginia. He's an incredibly elite defensive player. His 2.3 blocks per game, 1.3 steals per game. From an efficiency perspective as a defensive player, his numbers were some of the best that we've ever seen. I mean, he is a incredibly dominant wing defender, but he doesn't score. I mean, he just doesn't score the basketball. And so you're looking at a guy who, when you project him at the next level, it's kind of hard to see how that's going to shake out. They say defense wins championships. Leaf, where are you at, just kind of broadly, and we'll get into a bit of the specifics, with Ryan Dunn as a draft prospect? I know you've been in on him for a really long time, but kind of now that the dust has settled, where are you at with him?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was last year thinking this guy's one of the best returning players that no one knows about. And so I had him in my kind of 15th, I want to say. And I was like, okay, he's basically a lottery guy. He comes in, has 2 really good statistical games, and people fall in love and they say, wow, this guy's a great defender. And he puts up that production. And so people kept him in the lottery for a while. His numbers tailed off, and he was terrible offensively for the latter part of the season. And so I ended up having him around the end of the first round, maybe early second round. And then I started watching the NBA playoffs. And sometimes I do this. I think, what type of players win in leverage basketball? Mm-hmm. And then I try to apply that to the draft, because that's what people do. It's a copycat league. So you're going to emulate the players that have success late round and how they have stuck in the NBA. They need one standout skill. Well, Ryan Dunn's the best defender in the class, bar none. You can talk about Donovan Clingan, and he may be more valuable because he plays the drop coverage. He plays the center, and he's more refined because, you actually saw it on a championship team 2 years in a row. But Ryan Dunn's the better defender, if you ask me. So Ryan Dunn, the reason I have him number 20 right now on my board, I think, is essentially Peyton Watson doesn't shoot the ball well. He's a monster defensive player for one of the best teams in I was about to say the country, but in the NBA. And then you look at Jaden McDaniels. Now, McDaniels was touted for being offensively gifted coming into Washington, and he turned into this excellent defender. But the reason I bring up those two is they're both lengthy, wiry athletes who, when they come in the game, and obviously McDaniels starts, but when Watson comes in the game, he impacts everything. He flies around, messes everything up. And if you can make even 32% of threes, teams will actually have to guard you a little bit. And you can slash and you can impact the game by running the floor and doing little things, rebounding. Ryan Dunn had over 2 blocks a game as a wing on a team that in Virginia that plays slowly, meaning there's fewer possessions that they defend. So yeah, I think he's ridiculous. Like, he's an absolute anomaly defensively. And then he's great. He'll lock you down on the perimeter as well. And so while DeAndre Hunter was a really great defender in college, and he was maybe better like as a shutdown guy, Dunn's the more valuable going forward NBA defender because he messes things up. He screws with the other team's game plan. He guards your best player. He protects the rim. He does all these things. And if you're going to look at skill sets in a class that's deemed starless, and you're just saying, well, this is a skill that one player has, and this player, that might be the very top skill of anyone in the NBA draft. So why would you let that fall out of the first round? That's my premise on him. So I understand the reasons you would consider not, because he shot 20% from 3, but I would still take him in the first round, probably top 20.
I mean, I think another element of this too, and I think that you're absolutely right to talk about like who are the players who are thriving in the playoffs, and who are the kind of guys who are maybe getting played off the court in the playoffs as well. And with Dunn, like, you can clearly see what that role could look like in the playoffs, or even in the regular season next year. Like, it's obviously there. And I think you're right, in a class where there are a lot of players who don't necessarily have a standout skill that you can clearly see translating to the next level. Like Dunn has that. But I mean, we'd be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that the offense it's not just like, oh, it's a little behind. Like, it is not good. I mean, he's 20% on threes on 1 attempt per game. So he's a low volume shooter and a bad shooter. He's 53% from the free throw line. I mean, I think that sometimes there's a bit of an over reliance on using free throw data to predict 3-point shooting data. But when it's this bad, I mean, that has to be an alarm, a bit of a concern of like, hey, maybe he's a lockdown, shut him down defensive player who's all over the court and just raising hell constantly. But if we're playing 4-on-5 on the other end of the floor, like that has to limit his role a little bit as well. Having said all of that, I project that scouts probably feel more confident in their ability to turn a player into a better shooter than to turn a player into a better defensive player, because defense is a lot of instincts, a lot of length and athleticism. Like Dunn he has all of that. And if you think there's any chance we can turn him into, like you said, 32% 3-point shooter, if he can become that, all of a sudden his value rises exponentially. So I'm with you. I think scouts are probably going to say, look, we can improve you there. You're not going to be a 15-point per game guy. You're probably not even going to be a 9-point per game guy. But if you're a 6-point per game guy who hits, 2 uncontested threes a game, and you play lights out defense for 18 minutes, like that's a role that lasts you, half a decade or more in the NBA. So do you kind of think that there's any optimism that the offense improves for Dunn, or are you kind of like, it doesn't even matter, the defense is just that good?
I somewhere in between. I think the offense improves because you just get more confidence in different
Mm-hmm.
roles. And even if you're the dare shooter in the NBA, you put so much work into your shot and it improves
Mm-hmm.
even slightly. That's fine. But his
Yeah.
defense is the reason you'd be drafting him. Obviously, let me give you an example and then ask a question to kind of answer your question.
Mm-hmm.
Ironically enough, so here's the example. Herb Jones, his junior year at Alabama, everyone knew he was a good player. Obviously, his senior year he was the player of the year and defensive player of the year of the SEC. But his junior year, he shot 7% from three. 7. And now Herb Jones shoots low 30s in the NBA, still a dare shooter, but he's an all defensive team member. He was 5th in a defensive player of the year voting that came out yesterday. So if I'm not saying he has the point guard skills that Herb displayed at Alabama that made him alluring, but Herb went later and was 3 years older. He was a 5th-year senior when he came out. And so he does all that. So let's just say that's an archetype. Then my question to you would be, if this draft is not considered good, yet there is decent depth, and there's probably a lot of decent wings in the later part of the first round, how many players in a good draft actually stick? If you were to take 30 players, the top 30 players from the draft, how many actually play a role on teams like in the NBA, much less playoff teams? And those teams drafting in the 30s or 25 to 30 typically are the very best. And the answer is not very many. Like I've done this research before, and it changes year to year, obviously. And there are some hits that you get, but only about 20 players from a draft class really last a significant duration in the NBA. And then obviously it scales. Like once you factor in minutes, it gets really slim pickings. Well, why not take someone with a skill set that is so advanced on one side of the ball in a class that's considered weak? So that would be my pitch. I think he will struggle to shoot, but I think he's going to find his way on the court because he's an anomaly defensively.
Yeah, and I think you look at the teams that have succeeded drafting in the late first round, a lot of them are drafting like bigger physical wings. You mentioned Peyton Watson. I mean, Denver, they took Christian Braun, and that has worked extremely well for them. They took Peyton Watson. Jury's still a little bit out on Julian Strawther. Obviously, I'm a fan of Julian Strawther, and I think he will have an NBA career. But if he even it lasts 4 or 5 years at the 29th pick, you're happy with that for sure. So I think those, and Strawther in particular is not a defensive prospect, but Watson is. And now look, he's playing a significant role at the next level. So I do think like the odds of Dunn lasting 5, 6, 7+ years in the NBA, even if it's a small role, even if he's not an offensive contributor, feel a lot higher to me than even players who are kind of in that lottery range. Now, those players' upside might be a lot higher. You said you had him at 20th. I haven't done a big board specifically, but I've done a few mock drafts where I'm just kind of like trying to do team fits and whatnot. And I usually end up having Dunn get picked somewhere in the like 18 to 25 range. I think a good team that has shooters, that has a dynamic offense that just needs like a wing to come off the bench and wreak havoc defensively feels like the right fit for him. There are a handful of teams where I think that could make sense. But ultimately, the last question to you, Leaf, do you think when the first round is over that Ryan Dunn will have been picked, or do you think he's going to end up sliding into the second round? I know it depends on how the combine goes. We haven't gotten there yet, but what are your thoughts right now?
My gut tells me he will be picked because at the NBA combine, no one's going to score on him.
Yeah.
And they're going to say, well, shoot, like if that's the case and we're considering picking these guys, why not take the guy who's shutting them down? So my gut would say that. I've been wrong before on that. Like I went to the combine last year, and ironically, another Virginia guy, Reese Beekman, all the guards struggled, and some of them were picked in the first round. And you watched him, and you're like, well, they haven't even dribbled past him. And I'm not even exaggerating. Like he stole the ball, or they just pass it. And he came back to school, and he probably lowered his stock. Honestly, he just didn't have a good season for a bad team. I think Dunn, because of his size, makes it more of an alluring pick, and you can at least excuse it. If it doesn't hit, you're like, well, look, we were just trying to find some like a unique player, and it's not a great draft, so like whatever. Whereas if you take a guard there, it kind of becomes more of a squirrely proposition.
It's going to wrap it up for us today here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, folks. Thanks for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We'll be back on Thursday, keeping you up to date on any more transfer portal moves that are happening. Get you ready for next week, and of course, get you ready for the NBA Draft Combine and the G League Combine, as those things are coming up here shortly as well. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, as always, peace out.